Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and in this video I'd like to spend a little time talking about Chapter 4 in Drugs and Crime. We're very familiar with media depictions of our drug problem in the United States and internationally, and often we see articles that have a case of someone who engaged in violent behavior, and within that article is some mention of the use of illegal or legally used drugs, and so we see a lot of presentations of that, and so we need to begin to evaluate what those links are like and what the research shows. For example, your authors point out we need to ask several questions. First, we need to ask, does drug use lead to criminal behavior? Secondly, we need to ask, does crime lead to drug use? And third, is there a connection between criminal behavior and the use of drugs as a result of other factors? And so we can start putting this together, and really it gets complex because we're not just saying drugs cause crime or crime causes drug use, but there's all these other factors going on that will come into play that we'll see throughout the course. And there's different, in looking at how we approach drugs and crime, there are drug-defined crimes. For example, there's particular laws that prohibit having certain drugs or distributing or manufacturing of illegal drugs. And then there's drug-related crimes where a criminal act occurs and drug use contributes to that criminal act. And then there's drug-using lifestyle where drugs and criminal behavior are part of the individual or group's lifestyle. We also can look at the laws, and even though we see there's a lot of consistency or uniformity across places in the United States, marijuana certainly could be an exception there, and there's a whole chapter in your textbook on marijuana that we'll get to later. We also recognize that there are huge numbers of people that are arrested every year on drug-related offenses. In 2016, your authors point out 1.6 million drug-defined arrests were made. And we also know that, for example, in federal prison, that around half of the inmates are there for some drug-related offense. So this becomes extremely costly, not only to taxpayers and society from a financial point of view, but it's also very costly to families, to the workforce, to the people who will serve time and then be released. So I mean, there's costs all over the place, social, psychological, and financial, I guess is what I want to say here. And so we get into a lot of the debates on do crimes occur because people are under the influence of drugs, or do crimes occur because people need money to purchase drugs, or do crimes occur because people are involved in that as part of their occupation? And so we start getting these different questions about how and why people engage in drug use or drug distribution or sales. And of course, we're going to see this gets real complex. And we can see when your authors start talking about different ideas and models and theories. For example, a pharmacological approach would look at the effects of that drug on the person's behavior, on the person's thought process, their ability to maintain impulse control and a host of other factors. And then there's another model where we could look at more of the economic aspects of drugs. For example, where someone may assault someone and take their money so they can buy drugs for their drug habit. And there's also systemic violence where, for example, gang members may assault each other over a territory where drug dealing is occurring. And then, of course, the drug using lifestyle focuses more on how someone gets embedded into a particular style of interactions, of associates, of ways of behaving, and of engaging in certain illegal behaviors, not only illegal drug use, but also criminal activities as well. So obviously engaging in illegal drug use or having illegal drugs, that can be a crime in itself, but there may be other associated factors with that as well. So there's more discussion of some of the models and how all this occurs. And a lot of times we try to look at like a life course perspective, and we start thinking about, when do people start using drugs to start with, illegal drugs or illegal drugs, where they start using, for example, use drugs illegally that maybe later on when they're an adult they could use legally. For example, 14-year-old drinking alcohol versus a 28-year-old drinking alcohol. That obviously there are legal differences there. And we also know that there's a link between drug use and juvenile delinquency. So there's tons of research out there that shows that link. How all that occurs varies and leads to a lot of disputes. And so we can look at different surveys. And for example, the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance Survey is conducted by the U.S. Department of Health every other year. And it's a nationwide survey of high school students that looks at alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drug use, as well as sexual risk behaviors. And so you can actually go online and get the reports. You can look at the trends and the patterns. But this gives you an idea of what's going on. For example, in your text, they reproduce a table from the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a 2018 table from the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance United States 2017 study. And so here are the questions and responses. I'll just go over a few. And so we might look at the year they have there is 2017. Had 5 or more drinks of alcohol in a row within a couple of hours on at least one day in the past 30 days. Looking at youth, high school students, 14% responded that they did. That's actually down from the 24%, that responded affirmatively to that question in 2009. So that's actually good news there. Used marijuana 1 or more times in the past 30 days. In 2017, 20% reported that. In 2009, 21% did. So not a whole lot of change going on there. Just looking at 2017, ever used any form of cocaine 1 or more times, 5%. Ever took prescription drugs without a doctor's prescription, 14%. Engaged in a fight 1 or more times in the past 12 months, 24%. And carried a weapon on at least one day in the past 12 months, 16%. So you can start seeing the extent of the problem here. There's also the Arresti Drug Abuse Monitoring Program, ADAM, and this looks at drug use in the Arresti population, and it's much higher than in the general population in the United States. So that's relevant to look at. And also we can look at the National Crime Victimization Survey and what victims report regarding perpetrators' use of drugs or alcohol. Your authors also point out, for example, that females are less likely to engage in violent crime and more likely to commit property and drug crime. And they have a pathways theory they present where they look at trauma leading to substance abuse and then leading into the criminal justice system. So, a lot of times understanding these links and some of these patterns is important. And I think we're seeing more and more attention to early trauma related to substance abuse and criminal behavior later on. So we'll see that pattern where children are exposed to a variety of stresses and strain increases their risk for substance abuse and criminal behavior. I think the one slide here that really probably stands out for us is it's titled, "What Statistics Tell Us and What They Do Not." And your authors state that they show a correlation or a relationship, not a cause between drugs and crime. So there's always a lot that's going on, and that's going to be related to the specific crime, the specific type of drug that is utilized, or combination of drugs, and so there's a lot to look at. And for example, we may find that there's some differences when we compare, for example, criminal behavior related to alcohol use versus heroin use. And I think the key term here is interaction, interactional aspects of drug use and crime. And so that's really, I think, where your authors are focusing their attention. And they point out that it can be hard to separate criminality from substance use, and also cultural and subcultural factors. But they do point out that alcohol has the highest potential for causing aggressive and violent behavior, but we see that engaging in criminal acts is moderate. And so, it increases the risk, but a lot of people drink alcohol and are not violent. So I mean, we get a relational factor there, really. And of course, some types of drugs are illegal to use, so just the person using them or having them in their possession, I should say, is a crime in itself. And that's the old idea where people say, well, if you really want to reduce crime, change the laws or make less arrests, and then your crime rates go down. Of course, what you want to know also is use of drugs, for example, and how we need to always be careful when we're looking at statistics. For example, if we see a great drop in arrests for marijuana possession, but the laws have changed, that doesn't mean that there's less marijuana use. It doesn't mean there's more, but it means that the laws have changed, and we have to account for that. Especially if you throw in all the statistics, into a couple of summary stats that are presented for policies or political purposes. So you really have to, go in there and dissect the statistics carefully to look. For example, if someone says, well, crime has decreased in our community, first thing I'm going to ask them, are you talking about property crime or are you talking about violent crime? And then I'm going to look at specific property crimes and specific violent crimes. Are you talking about homicide? Are you talking about aggravated assault? What are we talking about here? And so that's important to look at. And the rest of the chapter really goes into some of the studies shows relationships and the strengths of those relationships regarding crime and drug use. And so that, I think, is important to take a look at. One of the things that we see in criminal justice research is looking at risk factors for illicit substance use and criminal behavior. So we start looking back at what are some of the features that are shared. For example, a deviant association with peers, education failure, having little parental supervision, poverty, strains and stresses, living in a violent household. Things of this nature, I think, are very important to look at. And then your authors talk a little bit about the social structure of illicit drug dealing and the different types of drug dealers and the different models that are used. And talk a little bit about the laws regarding money laundering and the methods that are used. It's interesting. I think back about my career, and I did work with only a few people that had been arrested, prosecuted, and spent time in prisons for drug offenses. A lot of the people that I worked with who used illicit substances did not get arrested or did not get embedded in the criminal justice system. A few did, but most didn't. So we have to always start thinking about how do we provide or prevent a lot of these problems from occurring in the first place. So I think that's helpful and relevant to think about as well. And this wraps up this video.